The Stanger Mounted Rifles were one of the Natal volunteer units that was established for the protection of Natal in the late 19th century, as regular imperial forces were never available in sufficient numbers to adequately protect and police the various colonies of the expansive British Empire alone. In 1872, the magistracy of the Tugela division of Victoria County was set up at the former site of King Shaka's principal homestead, Tugela. Throughout 1873, a town developed around this magistracy. This would be the town of Stanger, very close to the then border of Natal and Zululand. In late 1875, a volunteer corps was formed from the residents of the town. This was named the Stanger Mounted Rifles and established its headquarters in the town. The uniform of the Stanger Mounted Rifles consisted of a dark blue jacket edged in black braid. The collar and cuffs were also edged in black braid with a trifold knot above the cuffs. The blue cloth shoulder straps were edged in yellow. The trousers were dark blue with yellow piping running along the seam. They were issued with a white helmet, much like the British Foreign Service helmet. It seems likely this helmet had a white metal spike on the top. The badge on the helmet was also of white metal and consisted of the monogram SMR, surrounded by a laurel wreath and surmounted with a crown. The Stanger Mounted Rifles also had a round, relatively low-set blue forage cap with a black peak and a black chin strap. The forage cap had yellow piping and a version of the helmet badge that did not include the crown surmount. They wore a large pair of black leather riding boots, as well as a brown leather bandolier and a white haversack. Each trooper was equipped with a carbine. As Lord Chelmsford lacked regular imperial cavalry for the invasion of Zululand, he was forced to look elsewhere for mounted men to fulfill that vital role in Victorian military operations. One solution was to take men from the infantry who could ride and form mounted infantry companies. Another was to use the variety of Natal volunteer units consisting of mounted men. After lengthy discussion with an unwilling Sir Henry Bulwer, the then Lieutenant Governor of the colony of Natal, Lord Chelmsford eventually got permission to use the Natal volunteers in Zululand. The volunteers were generally very enthusiastic about the opportunity and were eager to join the upcoming invasion. Among these eager volunteers was the Stanger Mounted Rifles, led by Captain F. Addison. Addison had left England with his parents at the tender age of 1 and found himself in South Africa. He would go on to join the Victoria Mounted Rifles before transferring to the Stanger Mounted Rifles to take the role of a second lieutenant, later gaining his captaincy and command of the unit. Anticipating trouble with the Zulu nation, the Stanger Mounted Rifles were mobilized on the 1st of December 1878. 3 officers and 33 men reporting for duty. Latecomers would increase this number to a total of 46. The first duty of the Stanger Mounted Rifles occurred before the official start of hostilities and the invasion of the 11th of January. Their first duty was to provide 20 men as part of the considerable escort for the British Commission that was to meet with the Zulu representatives by the Tugela River on the 11th of December 1878. It was at this meeting that the impossible ultimatum that would start the war was forced upon the Zulu representatives. With the commencement of hostilities on the 11th of January, No.1 Column, the coastal column, under the command of Colonel Charles Pearson, made its final preparations to cross the lower Tugela River. Here, No.1 Column was joined by around 100 men of the Natal Volunteers. Among them, riding in from Thring's Post, were the Stanger Mounted Rifles. As Stanger was so close to the Zulu border, the Stanger Mounted Rifles were given the option to stay behind and act defensively. However, they were eager to join the invasion and left only 10 men behind to defend Stanger, the rest joining the invasion. The Natal Volunteers in No.1 Column found themselves under the command of Brevet Major Henry Stanley Burrow of the 19th Hussars. He was a well-respected officer with a distinguished career, which included a stint as Commandant of the School of Instruction for Auxiliary Cavalry. Having been put in command of all mounted forces in No.1 Column, the arrival of the Natal Volunteers brought his command up to strength. The volunteers joining a company of Imperial Mounted Infantry. Any celebrations of this joining of forces was dampened by a terrific thunderstorm. At 3:30 a.m., the bugle sounded, and 2 hours before dawn, the hard day ahead started. The Naval Brigade began ferrying troops across the river, and the first company of the Buffs was being ferried across at 5:30 a.m. By the end of the day, around 1,000 men, over 100 horses, and a vast quantity of baggage was across the Tugela. Although among the infantry, artillery, and wagons on the Zulu side of the river were half of Burrow's mounted infantry and the Victoria Mounted Rifles, it seems by the time ferrying of troops stopped at 8:30 p.m, the Stanger Mounted Rifles remained for now on the Natal side. After a night with another thunderstorm, the Naval Brigade were ferrying troops across the river again at 4:30 am. By mid-afternoon, after replacing some of the boats, the last of the troops, including the Stanger Mounted Rifles, were ferried across to Zululand. On the 15th of January, once supplies had been built up, Major Barrow was ordered to take his mounted men, including the Stanger Mounted Rifles, to make a reconnaissance of the planned invasion route up to the Nyezane River. The men of the Stanger Mounted Rifles patrolled across a vast landscape of grassland and hills, scouting for any signs of large-scale Zulu activity, searching for cattle to loot and establishing the condition of the road ahead. Barrow reported back no large bodies of Zulus, merely a group of around 20 that quickly melted back into the landscape. A series of signal fires were observed in a chain from hilltop to hilltop, signalling the British approach. The lack of cattle looted, merely 9, was among a strong indication the Zulus had ample warning of the British approach. A large camp now sprang up on the Zulu bank. The Stanger Mounted Rifles pitched their tents with the rest of the mounted men behind the infantry. Throughout the 16th of January, the British infantry and engineers built a fort on the Zulu bank named Fort Tenedos. By the evening, Colonel Pearson was ready to make his plans for the following day's first big movement. He had under his command a mixed force of Imperial Infantry, Royal Artillery, Naval Brigade, Natal Native Contingent, Natal Pioneer Corps, and the Natal Volunteers, around 4,893 men in total. Their objective was to seize the mission station at Eshowe, to use as a secure base and supply depot to launch the next part of the invasion towards Ulundi, in conjunction with Lord Chelmsford's invasion force. In order to seize Eshowe as quickly as possible, Pearson decided to form his column into 2 separate divisions. He would lead the first, a so-called flying column, to make for the mission station with as much haste as possible, bringing only 50 of the 384 wagons. This would be a mixed force and the strongest of the 2 divisions. The Stanger Mounted Rifles were a part of this flying column. As the column made its eventual start, early on the 18th of January, the mounted men formed protective screens ahead and on the flanks of the column. The Stanger Mounted Rifles would have formed a part of one of these screens. They marched through a desolate countryside, the Stanger Mounted Rifles constantly on the lookout for any potential signs of trouble or threat, but along with the rest of the mounted men, saw nothing of note. By 1:30 p.m, they had reached the next milestone, the Nyezane River. This steep bank river was really a small and muddy stream, but it was still a cumbersome process to get the wagons across, requiring a double span of oxen. Camp was made 200 yards beyond the river. During this day, Barrow took a portion of his men, Stanger Mounted Rifles possibly included, on a reconnaissance up to the Umsunduzi River and onto the Tugela River. Nothing of note beyond a few scouts were seen during this maneuver, and the men returned for a wet, rain-sodden night in the camp. On the morning of the 19th, Pearson realized that the roads had been turned into a quagmire by the rains and decided to await the arrival of the 2nd Division. Having heard rumors that King Cetshwayo had sent a regiment to attack the column, Pearson sent the mounted men to scout around for more information while the column sat out the morning rain. The Stanger Mounted Rifles patrolled along the hillsides and grassland in the rain, looking for any signs of this regiment or other Zulu movement, but nothing was found. When the 2nd Division came into sight at 1 p.m, the 1st was getting ready to move off. The 2nd Division was ordered to head for the new camp across the Nyezane, and Pearson left them 3 companies of the Buffs to bolster the force. The flying column reached the Umsunduzi at 2:45 p.m. The Stanger Mounted Rifles and other Natal volunteers scouting and providing flank yards the whole way. The river was around 65 feet high and waist deep, requiring until 6:15 p.m. to get the whole force across. By this time, the 2nd Division was spread across the trail, with the head of the division at the Umsunduzi and the tail still at the Nyezane. That night, the British column was extremely spread out and vulnerable, though despite Barrow's men sighting a group of around 50 Zulus, no attack came. Major Barrow took the mounted men to investigate the Tugela and determined that it was impassable that day, the 20th. Pearson, on learning this, sent out a work party with a detachment of the Natal volunteers to act as vedettes to prepare the crossing. At 4:30 p.m. on the 21st of January, the 1st Division moved off towards the Tugela. By 6:45, they arrived and, finding it now passable, spent a majority of the day crossing. On this day, Pearson had also heard information of a Zulu force of around 4,000 to 5,000 warriors concentrating to the east around 5 miles off. This day would see the Stanger Mounted Rifles performing a great deal of scouting duty. Along with the rest of Barrow's command, they thoroughly searched with the grass and bush for any concealed Zulus and burned down around 15 small homesteads that may have provided the nearby Zulus with shelter. The British scouting had been so successful, it had denied the Zulus sufficient opportunity for their own scouting. As a result, the Zulu commander in the area, Kodida, had no clear idea on the exact whereabouts of the British column. Though when the British made camp that night, it became apparent the Zulu force had found them and come very close, as the grass around the camp had been thoroughly pressed down by the warriors, as the British discovered the next morning. On the 22nd of January, at 4 a.m., the 1st Division marched out again, the Stanger Mounted Rifles and the Victoria Mounted Rifles forming an advanced guard. Pearson wanted the area thoroughly scouted ahead of the advancing column. The advance was tough going, with the road in poor condition, but eventually the mounted men crossed the Nyezane River. Barrow found a suitable area for the column to rest, there being a large area of grassy flatland surrounded by bush. Beyond, the trail took a sharp turn to the left and up a series of terraces, flanked by high spurs and narrow ravines, with the formidable Wombane Hill to the right of the track. He sent a note to Pearson with his findings. A portion of the mounted men were established as vedettes. The Stanger Mounted Rifles, along with the Victoria Mounted Rifles, were allowed to fall out, eat breakfast, and some took the chance to wash in the stream. Slowly, the 1st Division began arriving, but there were reports of Zulus in the area, and when a company of NNC was sent out to investigate, the company ranged out into the hills and found the Zulu army. Disintegrating before the Zulus' sudden attack, the Battle of Nyezane was on. The Stanger Mounted Rifles were still relaxing, some bathing when the battle began. They made a scramble for their uniform and equipment, Trooper Howard being hit by a painful blow to the leg from a spent round. They rode together with the Victoria Mounted Rifles to the foot of the hills, where the wagons were parking, and joined the rest of Barrow's mounted force. They advanced 50 yards and opened fire on the Zulus advancing down from the Wombane. The men of the Stanger Mounted Rifles then advanced in skirmish order together with the Victoria Mounted Rifles and established themselves on a small rise where they had a better view all around of the developing battle. In the process, they mistakenly fired upon a group of retreating NNC. Upon realizing this, they quickly redirected their fire to a group of Zulus advancing over the crest of the spur ahead in the track. One trooper from the Stanger Mounted Rifles, before they commenced firing, recalled, "We were not long left in doubt as to where the enemy was, for looking a little further ahead, every hillside was swarming with them. Down they came, rushing in on us, and defiling as they surrounded us, disappearing into the bushy ravines below, soon to be seen swarming over the next ridge nearer to us, and preparing to rush down it and close in with us. There seemed to be no end of them, and exclamations such as, 'By Jove, look at them over yonder! Good heavens, look at them over there!' were heard on every side. It was a lull before the storm, for there was not a shot being fired." Godida's army was now committed to a major attack, and the British were scrambling to counter it. Having been attacked on the march, the Buffs, Royal Artillery, and the Naval Brigade were all quickly brought into action, taking up positions on the knoll by the side of the track, passing through a number of the mounted men. As this portion of the British force came into action, and reinforcements from further down the column were brought up at the double, only the Zulu left horn had pressed forwards. The centre and the right were only just coming into view. The British engaged the Zulus with all arms, and the Zulus kept pressing forwards. Some Zulus fired on the British from the hillside and caused casualties, while others pushed forwards and were forced to seek cover from British fire. The Stanger Mounted Rifles were around 200 yards to the left of the knoll and were keeping a steady volume of carbine fire directed at the Zulus who were trying to maneuver towards the British left. The Stanger Mounted Rifles, alongside their comrades in the Victoria Mounted Rifles, were able to lay down a steady and accurate fire that checked the Zulu advance heading straight for them. Some warriors tried to cross the final patch of open ground, showing no fear in the face of the volunteers' fire. They were nonetheless cut down. Some tried to divert their course, but ran into the fire from other mounted troops. By now, the Zulus on the Wombane were starting to retreat, having bravely faced withering British fire from rifles, artillery, rockets, and a Gatling gun. Portions of the British force advanced behind them. The Zulus nearly regained their initiative, but another push by the British forced them into an orderly retreat. The Stanger Mounted Rifles were now ordered to advance past the former Zulu positions, seeing up close the effect of their carbine fire. They were sent to support the other mounted troops, but when they arrived, the action was already over. The Zulu force made an orderly retreat through the hills, having severely pressed the British and shown great courage, but ultimately being forced back. The Stanger Mounted Rifles had performed very well in the Battle of Nyezane. Having rapidly responded to the surprise of the attack, formed up, manoeuvred, and fired with a great deal of skill and courage. They had taken no casualties in the engagement, the only injury being the spent round that hit Trooper Howard. Captain Addison had good reason to be proud of his men. The battlefield was tidied, the British dead buried, and the soldiers given 2 hours rest before resuming their march to that night's bivouac, around 5 miles away from Eshowe. The Stanger Mounted Rifles and the Victoria Mounted Rifles formed the rear guard for this march, finally reaching the camp and being able to eat at 9 p.m. On the 23rd of January, the column began the final stretch to Eshowe, reaching it without incident around 10 a.m., with the end of the column arriving at 3 p.m. The soldiers were allocated their positions and began the process of turning the old mission station into a strong point and supply depot. Over the coming days, the required work at the mission station was undertaken and wagons came in and were prepared to leave. Rumours began coming in that Durnford and his natives had been defeated. False alarms occurred at Eshowe, and the Zulus could be heard spreading the news of a great victory from hilltop to hilltop. On the 27th of January, Major Barrow took the mounted men to do a reconnaissance of the next leg of the march. They spotted a group of Zulus, but made no attempt to pursue. Eshowe was further fortified in the meantime. Early on the 28th, the mounted men went out on another reconnaissance. They were ordered back to Eshowe quickly, though, to find a great scene of confusion. Colonel Pearson had received orders from Lord Chelmsford to disregard all previous plans, prepare to face the whole Zulu army, and decide if he was able to hold Eshowe. After a strenuous council of war, he decided they could hold, and the fortification of the camp was pursued with even more vigour. It was to this scene that Barrow arrived back. He was told of the situation and that his men, the Stanger Mounted Rifles among them, and the NNC, would return to Tugela, there being no room for them in the camp. So hasty was their send-off that the Natal volunteers had to leave behind a great deal of their personal belongings and set off. Barrow and his men would eventually reach the camp on the lower drift at 11 p.m. The Stanger Mounted Rifles and other Natal volunteers camped for the night outside Fort Tenedos. In the early morning of the 31st of January, the Stanger Mounted Rifles, with a few other volunteer units, were sent to investigate a report of Zulus crossing the Tugela. This proved to be a false alarm. Here they would now spend some months of relative inactivity. The Stanger Mounted Rifles would be moved to Thring's Post, and here they would stay until March. In the passing time, Colonel Pearson had remained in Eshowe, and Lord Chelmsford had received a great deal of reinforcements and was preparing a relief column to come to Colonel Pearson's aid. Most of the Stanger Mounted Rifles and other Natal volunteers offered to join the relief expedition in late March, but much to their disgust, they were refused. A small scratch detachment, formed from 59 volunteers, was formed into a new unit, led by Captain Addison of the Stanger Mounted Rifles. This unit would be the Natal Volunteer Guides. Although men from the Stanger Mounted Rifles were with the Volunteer Guides, most notably Captain Addison, the integral unit that was the Stanger Mounted Rifles ended its most notable contributions to the war here. They had served with distinction, avoided casualties, and faced the mighty Zulu charge head-on. They had proven very capable mounted riflemen. Sources used for this video were Fearful Hard Times, The Siege and Relief of Eshowe, 1879, by Ian Knight and Ian Castle. Zulu War, Volunteers, Irregulars and Auxiliaries, by Ian Castle. And Zulu Rising, by Ian Knight. This was another video in the Units of the Anglo-Zulu War series by yet another history channel. Any mistakes made during this video were entirely my own. Thank you very much for watching, and I hope this was of interest to somebody somewhere. If it was, do feel free to leave a like or comment or subscribe, or indeed feel free to criticize strongly in the comment section too. Thank you very much.